Hey folks, David Stewart here. It's time for the Final Fantasy II review. I did the review of Final Fantasy I after I played it with you all on stream in January. I got to play Final Fantasy II through the end of January and in February, and I really enjoyed playing it on stream and chatting with all of you, so thank you for making this experience quite a bit of fun. This is the Final Fantasy game that apparently is kind of the black sheep of the family, and I think it's due to its leveling system. But I really enjoyed playing it. I enjoyed the battle system and the leveling system, and I liked the story as well. So I'd like to do a little bit of a deeper analysis and talk about some of the things that this game did really well and why I enjoyed playing it with you all so much. So let's start by talking about the various different versions of the game that exist. The version I played was for the PSP, but this is one of those Final Fantasy games, and a lot of the early ones are like this. There's a lot of different versions out there, so let me help you decide which version to play. The original version was for the Famicom in Japan, but was never released in the West. Instead, we got Final Fantasy IV, labeled as Final Fantasy II for the Super Nintendo, and Final Fantasy II and III were just kind of disappeared from the record for a couple of years. So if you want to play this on the NES, you're going to have to actually speak Japanese, or at least read Japanese, or you're going to have to try to find some sort of fan translation. Otherwise, you're going to be looking at all of the versions which follow up the Final Fantasy Origins version for the PlayStation 1. This itself is kind of interesting because the Final Fantasy Origins game was actually released for the PlayStation 1 after the release of PlayStation 2, and so most people that I know who have it played it on the PlayStation 2, not on the PlayStation 1. Kind of weird. Then there's another version for the Game Boy Advance, which is based on that new version for the PlayStation 1. It has a little bit of an enhanced script, and it has a lower resolution, and it also has some bonus dungeons. So if you can get your hands on that cartridge and you want to play it on your Game Boy Advance or your DS, that's a pretty good option as well. The PlayStation Portable version is the version I played, which you can buy on the Sony store as of this recording if you want to play it like I did on the PlayStation Vita. A really good platform for playing this game. Otherwise, you could buy it on a mobile platform, either iOS or Android. Last I checked today, it was $8 on the Play Store. I think that's a pretty good price for this game, and this is a pretty good port all around. So what you get with this enhanced port, it's based on that Final Fantasy Origins version. You get an enhanced set of graphics, rather true to the 8-bit original, but with more colors and generally more detail and a little higher resolution than what you would get on either the NES or the SNES. You get a rearranged soundtrack that I think sounds great versus the original 8-bit soundtrack, which is still okay if you are going to play it on the NES. And you get that enhanced script. Because I don't own it on mobile, I can't tell you if it has good controller support or not. I have the original Final Fantasy on mobile, and that's a pretty good port and works pretty good without the need for controller support. So decide which version you would like to play, and my advice is to play one of those ports. In general, I think they're very good translations of what is at its core a pretty good Final Fantasy game. So let's go a little bit deeper and let's talk about some of the different categories here. I'm going to start with the gameplay because I think the gameplay is the most important part of a game. It's what makes it a game. The art of the game is the gameplay. So there's 3 different levels of gameplay in this game, as there are with most: the micro, the macro, and the meta. The micro level gameplay takes the form of turn-based battles where you have the heroes on one side and you have the monsters on the other side. You use a menu system to attack the monsters, to decide what sort of actions your characters are going to take, like healing each other or casting magic, and then the monsters perform counter actions, the goal with each battle being to clear the battle as quickly and efficiently as possible while taking the least amount of damage and using the least amount of resources. This is pretty standard for most Final Fantasy games, especially Final Fantasy games up through Final Fantasy X, so there's nothing really new here. I will say that the micro-level gameplay of Final Fantasy II is a little bit less engaging than it was in Final Fantasy I because of one little change to the system that makes the game easier, and that is instead of your character basically hitting nothing if a creature they're trying to kill dies before they can perform their action, you will just attack the next monster in line. This means you have to do a little bit less thinking about how much health a monster has and how likely you are to kill it in order to efficiently clear the battle. Instead, you can just have all of your characters spam attacks and they'll just go through the monster list and clear it out. It makes, in general, the micro-level gameplay a little more grindy and a little bit less engaging, but in general, it's okay. I enjoy turn-based battles, and there was enough challenge and enough variety of monsters that I was able to play through the entire game and not really get bored of the combat. The macro level of gameplay, like most Final Fantasy games, involves managing your HP and your MP, your restorative items like potions, as well as your equipment. Basically everything that goes on between battles is the macro level of gameplay. And at the macro level, what you're trying to do is make it through a dungeon without your party dying off completely and getting a game over. I had a couple game overs while playing this, which means I was able to fail at the macro level several times, but the goal is that you want to manage your resources so that you don't get wiped out by a dungeon. While this was probably the toughest part of the first Final Fantasy game, it's a little bit easier in Final Fantasy II, especially once you get a handle of the meta, the leveling system. It's not such a big deal to really worry about having to clear out a dungeon. But like I said, I did get a game over a few times, so there is definitely some challenge to be had at the macro level. The next level is the meta level. This is the thinking about how the game systems work level of gameplay. And in this game, it is the leveling system. So while the meta was fairly simple in Final Fantasy I, it involved you went out, you killed monsters, you got gold and experience. The experience made your characters get stronger by leveling them up. The gold made your characters get stronger because you could buy equipment and skills with it. In this one, you have that, but instead of a leveling system where you just level up and get stronger, all of your skills level up. It's like an Elder Scrolls game rather than a traditional JRPG. I say that word traditional kind of oddly here because this is a pretty early JRPG, which would make it a traditional game. But this is not the style of leveling that really stuck in the Final Fantasy franchise or, for that matter, other JRPG franchises like Dragon Quest. This is also the part of the game that I think makes Final Fantasy II a bit of a black sheep of the family. It's really different from the other leveling systems. Rather than having classes where you have, white mage, black mage, fighter, and you level up and the class just gets better at what it does, every character's more or less a blank slate and just gets better at the things that it does repeatedly in battle. I mentioned Elder Scrolls. It's a lot like an Elder Scrolls game. As you use your sword, you get more sword skill. As you use your spear, you get more spear skill. As you get hit, you get more HP. As you use magic, you gain more MP. As you use your fire spell gets stronger and stronger. And this is the way that your characters progress at the meta level. It's how they get stronger and stronger and stronger. Because it's so different from other JRPGs, I think some people can be a little bit annoyed with the system or try to manage it more than I think it needs to be managed. For my part, I actually really enjoyed the meta of Final Fantasy II. It's not perfect, but in general, I really like it. Maybe that's because I come from a CRPG background where I've played a lot of games that just have leveling up skills, and so it was really natural and easy for me to do this in Final Fantasy II. But I think you actually don't have to think too much about the systems at play. If you put good equipment on your characters and you go out and you fight monsters, they're just going to naturally get stronger. So if you play it like a normal JRPG, you're going to end up more or less with a party like you'd get in a normal JRPG. You may have a character who specializes in using a sword, a character who specializes in using a spear or using magic or something like that. Or if you really understand the systems, as I came to understand them, then you can create a party of very strong, very robust characters that are very versatile. And this is, I guess, one of the problems with the meta levels. Once you really understand it, the game can become quite easy, almost trivial, when you're able to actually manage the leveling of your characters. Your characters can all become very, very strong, so that even the final dungeon of the game is quite quick and easy to get through. If you want to know what I did as far as leveling my characters, as well as, I guess, what I recommend, The first thing I did was I put shields and weapons on my characters, or in some cases 2 shields. You can put a shield in each hand. They can't really attack, but this will level up their shield skill. You go out and fight monsters and have them hit you a bunch, or you can have your characters hit each other even if you want to. And this will level up your shield skill. And I did that for about 15 or 20 minutes when I first started the game. And it provided such a good base for building all of my characters on. They were so robust at the beginning of the game. I never really had a problem leveling up really at all. I don't really think this is completely necessary though. What I would recommend people do is pick a weapon specialty for each character. So you can have your first character just use swords, and your second character just use spears, your third character just use axes. That's what I did. And have every character wear a shield. Shields will make your characters very robust and very hard to kill. It's more important that they are more robust than they do lots of damage. You could have them dual wield swords or do a sword and an axe. There's a bunch of different varieties that you can do in the game. Really, it's very wide open, kind of like an Elder Scrolls game. But I recommend you do the shields because it will make the characters really strong and really easy to level up at the beginning. And whenever you get a new weapon, you can just put it on the character that has that weapon specialty, rather than having the character switch between different weapon specialties and have to level those up. And in the meantime, it's not doing a lot of damage. Anyway, just have one character per weapon type. Then have different characters specialize in different kinds of magic. So you can have one character do thunder magic. And what's kind of cool about Final Fantasy II is rather than having to buy different levels of the same spell, same basic spell like thunder, thundaga, that kind of stuff, you just buy thunder, and as you use it, it gets stronger and stronger and stronger. So you have one character, their black magic is thunder. So if you want to use black magic, they use thunder. The next one uses blizzard. The next one uses fire. And as you get each new black magic, each character has a specialty in it. One of them has flare. One of them has ultima when you get that. And that way, that level of magic is always very high and does a lot of damage. And each character will be gaining enough MP to use auxiliary spells like aura or something like that. So again, on the meta level, you have to manage your magic use if you actually want to use magic in the game by using spells pretty frequently. But that's my advice for how to keep all of your characters pretty strong in the magic area, and make sure that you have 3 levels of strong black magic that you can use. This is very important because a lot of enemies in the game have an elemental weakness. And if you know that elemental weakness, that means that you can have a high level spell ready to exploit that weakness whenever you encounter that enemy. This brings me to one of the downsides of this leveling system, which is that magic is just not as good as I feel like it should be. It wasn't as good as I feel like it should have been in Final Fantasy I, mostly due to bugs in the programming. In this case, it's not as good as it should be, mostly because you have to spam the spell over and over again in order to get it high enough level for it to work sometimes. So if you want to use a spell like Toad, which turns the enemies into toads, it's basically an insta-kill spell, so it's very powerful. You have to get it up to a really high level, and that means you're going to have a character just casting the spell and having it not work for long periods of time. It's kind of a wasted combat round. So it's generally better to just have your characters do one black magic spell each, and otherwise don't really use magic, because the other kind of magic, the CC isn't really necessary in most cases, or for most pulls, for most mob groups. You don't really need to do a lot of crowd control. And otherwise, the black magic is just generally stronger, and you always know it's going to be at a high level. So I would really not focus too much on anything besides the curative spells being a high level. Maybe have level up aura and protect and shell magic by using those pretty frequently, and otherwise just stick to black magic. You don't need to worry about stuff like curse or toad or anything like that. They aren't really going to work on bosses anyway, so their usefulness, unfortunately, is just not very high. And in general, physical attack damage is just stronger and easier to use in this game, which means your 3 main characters that are consistent in your party, you're probably going to want to focus on their physical attacks with magic as a secondary thought. Even Ultima magic, I had to spam it all the way through the last dungeon to try to get it to a high enough level that it could damage the final boss. And even then, it was doing less damage in a lot of cases than just the physical attacks. You are going to want to have magic, though, because there's plenty of enemies that if they're just a little bit higher level than you, your physical attacks just won't do anything, but your magic will still harm them. So it's good to have that magic in your back pocket. So gameplay, overall, I think it's pretty good. I did enjoy the meta. The micro wasn't quite as engaging as it should have been. So I'm going to give the gameplay a 7 out of 10 in general. That's average for me. That's like a C grade because there's some flaws with the meta and because the micro is just a little bit less engaging than it used to be. And the macro is also a little bit easier than it used to be. But it was a lot of fun. I never once got bored of playing the game all the way through as far as the gameplay goes. And I think it's a great little twist on what most people think of as classic JRPG gameplay. But I think it shows right from the beginning, by the way, that they were wanting to experiment with what Final Fantasy meant. As I transition into story here, they really wanted to, with each game, try out new things. You see that with Final Fantasy 2 and 3 and 4. In this one, they really completely went wild with the leveling system and tried a whole new leveling system, and I think it's pretty cool that they did that. In Final Fantasy 3, they also do that with the jobs system. They just do different systems for every game versus something like Dragon Quest that's been very consistent with how it manages its macro, meta level gameplay. In general, I think the experimentation was good. So transitioning into story, this is also something that you see with Final Fantasy II that is new, which is that it's a new world with a new story, and it's not a story sequel of any kind to Final Fantasy I. It's a brand new story, and that is a tradition that is going to stick all the way through the franchise, and I think it's a great thing. In this way, you're not trying to constantly rehash or figure out new ways to tell sequel stories in the same universe where evil is never defeated. You get to always have an epic story experience where you are fighting some grand, massive, menacing evil and overcoming it in every single game. No exception with Final Fantasy II. So let's go through the story stuff. Most of this is from the mind of Hironobu Sakaguchi, the director of the first game and also this game. The story in general is about connecting the different set pieces. It's really about the setting. The story gets you to move through the various parts of the world and experience those different parts of the world and the different dungeons more than it's there to provide a really strong and consistent and moving narrative experience. That being said, I still enjoyed the narrative of Final Fantasy II, particularly this version, which is based on the Final Fantasy Origins version for the PlayStation 1. Very good script in general. So the setting level, it's good. It gets you to go through all the different settings and experience all the different aesthetics, the different characters. It's just a good approach, I think, to gameplay, and that's why you see it so much in the classic JRPGs and all of the games, newer games maybe that are made with RPG Maker that are based on these classic JRPGs. So what we get with Final Fantasy II that I think is a little different than Final Fantasy I, and I like, is an actual focus on characters. Now, you can name your characters in Final Fantasy II, but it's clear that they have some sort of identity. In the version I played for the PSP, which is the same as the Android version, you get character portraits that are designed or based on designs by Yoshitaka Amano, and they look really good, and they give you a sense that that character has a personality. The characters speak dialogue, and they speak with their own voices. So even though you've named them, and I let the chat name them for when I was doing this, so even though you've named them, they still have their own voices and their own personality, which is something that you'll see a lot more prominent in later Final Fantasy games, where it almost becomes a joke that you can't name your character in Final Fantasy IV. You have the naming way, little rabbit guy who is unable to change the name of your character. Your character is Cecil. That's who he is. In this case, you can name the characters, but they still have their voice. The other characters that come in and out of your party, I feel like are there and have their own voice as well. They would be kind of throwaway characters if this were just a novel, but because they enter your party, they join you after an event, and then they leave your party either by dying or something else happening to them, you feel the loss in their party a little bit more acutely than you'd feel with some character coming in and out of a story. So there's one character that you meet in a town, and you go and you journey to this ice village, and then he sacrifices himself at the end when he leaves the party. And because you spent a couple of hours adventuring with him, you kind of feel like you lose a character. You go back and talk to his daughter, and there's a little bit of an emotional impact from that. So the characters, I think, are a definite step up from the first game, and I generally like them. You also have characters that really drive the plot forward, like the princess. You have Minwoo, whose loss is a sad moment. You have Sid, whose death is a sad moment. You have a lot of these character deaths that are really juiced, considering that this was originally done on a little 8-bit Nintendo disc. Pretty cool that you're able to have that kind of emotional impact at play in one of these early games. So I really did like it, and I did feel a good connection with the characters. But it's much simpler than what you would get in the later Final Fantasy games, particularly those for the PlayStation. Lastly, let's talk about plot. So we did setting, characters, plot. The plot is what kind of binds things together. This is what pushes you through those different set piece areas. The plot is more complex than Final Fantasy 1. Final Fantasy 1 was go restore the crystals, or go take these crystals and restore the orbs. In this one, you really are in kind of a grand story. You are starting the game, and you are the victim of an attack by an evil empire. Yes, evil empires are really good setups for plots and for stories in general, because you have something that's overwhelmingly evil. You don't know if you can defeat it, and you have to figure out a way to beat it. And that's exactly the setup for this. You're part of the rebellion. You're part of the plucky do-gooders who are trying to fight the evil empire. And so you start by going on really simple missions, and as your characters grow, you take on more and more responsibility. The scale of the conflict grows as you go through the plot. So it starts with doing a little mission for a princess, and then eventually it grows into overthrowing the empire. Before you overthrow the empire, you have to stop their evil dreadnought, which is like a Death Star. So if this seems like Star Wars, yeah, it's a lot like Star Wars in that case. You have to stop this dreadnought, which is destroying all the villages and killing all the people. And after you do that, it scales up even more. You have to overthrow the evil emperor. And then you get some really great little plot twists towards the end of this. And on your journey through the plot, you get sidetracked a lot. So there is a bit of an Odyssey format where you go to each little area and there's a little story that exists there, kind of like in the first game. The first game is very much an Odyssey. You go to this town, there's something you have to do for people in that town. You solve it, you go to the next town, something you have to do for people in that town. This is somewhat similar to that, but it's a lot more cohesive. You do get sidetracked, you get eaten by like a monster whale thing. You have to go to all these exotic locations in order to solve the next problem and get you one step closer to the Emperor. Even when you beat the Emperor, turns out there's an even bigger, badder Emperor, and there's some great twists there. I don't want to get all the story spoilers out, but there's a great little twist as to who's really going to take over the Empire. And then you beat him, and it gets even bigger and crazier, where you end up fighting the devil himself at the end. And so this is something that I really, really liked about this story, is that it felt like a pulp tale or some space opera of yore, where the scale just keeps growing bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until you're literally fighting the devil himself at the end, the Lord of Hell, who's come to take over the world. And he has the biggest sprite in the game, the craziest, coolest looking sprite. He is the hardest boss in the game, and you're finally able to destroy him and overcome the grandest evil that you can think of, the devil, and restore peace to the land. So I really enjoyed the plot for this for what it was. It's not a big, heavy, thick plot that meanders or has some sort of deep revelations about characters. It's a pretty straightforward bang through a bunch of different set pieces on your way to fighting a final boss, which gives you a feeling of epic accomplishment. I definitely approve of this plot. So in general, I think the story execution for this version, which, like I said, is based on that PlayStation 1 version, is pretty good. I'd give it, for what it is, I'll give it an 8 out of 10, which means it's pretty good. There's a couple little flaws. It's not super deep in areas, but for the time it was released and for what you're wanting out of it, I think it's a great little story with lots of little personality and plenty of little emotional moments that I think are pretty good for what you have in this this kind of JRPG gameplay for when it was originally released. Very good. Next, let's move on to aesthetics, which I really liked for this remake of the game. They're inspired by the 8-bit originals, but are by no means just an upscale of them. They're completely redone from the ground up, but they still have the personality of early Final Fantasy games. The sprites still have a pixel aesthetic. You have a higher resolution, but not so high that you lose sight of the original pixels, which gives it that original feel. You have a lot more colors than what you had on the NES or the Famicom, obviously, but not so saturated a color palette that it loses the feel of a pixel art game. In general, I liked the large number of colors. I loved the monster sprites, which were based on the original ones, but higher detail, more colors in general. They're still static. They don't move like the original game. So the monsters usually just kind of flash when they do an attack, whereas the heroes actually have an animation. I think it's a great example of high quality 2D or high quality retro. In general, I liked it, and I liked that the characters were designed with costumes in mind. Rather than seeing the class or the job like you would with the first game or even with the third game, you have an individual look for each character, which is nice. And this is something that would be very, very present in later Final Fantasy games. Instead of having characters change appearance based on what class they are, they have a set appearance based on who they are, and that's what you get to look at. In fact, I think the only graphics that really change are the weapons that you have equipped for them, which each of them will have a little bit different look depending on what weapon they happen to be holding. So in general, I give the aesthetics a 9 out of 10 for sure. The only flaw is in some cases the scale between the sprites and the objects inside of a building seem a little bit off. Now, lastly, I will talk about music. The score is another classic Final Fantasy score by Nobuo Uematsu, who delivers a whole new set of music for this game. It doesn't really reuse anything from the first game except for the harp theme, which you hear at the beginning of the game, and the victory theme after you finish a battle. Everything else that I remember is new, and it's all really good. So the rearranged version of the soundtrack is what you're going to get if you buy these newer ports of the game. And I think this rearranged version of the soundtrack is the best version of the soundtrack. I went and listened to the 8-bit version. The 8-bit version is great for what it is, but this new arranged version I think is a perfect example of what high quality MIDI music should be. You get a full feeling of sampled instruments, oboes to guitars. Things have a great evocative mood to them. You feel like you're actually seeing the music that Nobuo Uematsu envisioned when he was writing the original score for it. So in general, I really like it. It's one of my favorite scores, I'd say, of the first 6 Final Fantasy games, if I'm putting it into context with like 4, 5, and 6 especially. I think it really holds up, and there's some themes that are just great in here. The only downside, I think, to the music is I just hear that one battle theme a little bit too much. It gets a little bit old, and people were saying it in chat. They're like, I'm kind of tired of hearing that battle theme over and over again. So we put on some other music for the stream. So that is the one downside. That's not really Uematsu's fault. It would just be nice if there was more than one battle theme. That's something that you get in later Final Fantasy games, is you get some different varieties for battle themes. So while you fight a battle, as you go through different parts of the game, you get different battle themes. We weren't really there yet with this game, but the battle theme is good enough that it took me a really long time to get bored of it, considering how often you are in a battle. So in general, I think the music is a 9 out of 10. I think it's a great score, and you can just go listen to the complete score from the Final Fantasy Origins game and enjoy it if you want. I think it's a great score to listen to with a lot of variety and some great feelings, especially when you get to the final level and the final boss. Just a really good score in general. So that's what I think about this game. In general, I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10. I thoroughly enjoyed the experience, and I really enjoyed playing it on stream with all of you, chatting with me, and making it a really, really fun time and more, I guess, invigorating experience than it would otherwise have been. I think it's a great example of how you can remake a game in a way that's very true to the vision and the feeling of the original game, while moving well past the original hardware limits of the computer that it was designed for. So yes, that's it, Final Fantasy II. Let me know what you think about it down below in this rather long analysis, and I will enjoy reading it, and I'll see you guys next time. You can read more of my stuff or find out more about me at dvspress.com. You can join my mailing list at dvspress.com/list, and there's also links to all of my books over there. So have a good one, and I'll see you next time.